All right, diving into our second game. This one's incredible. Here, Hans Niemann is playing as white, Magnus is black, and Hans Niemann heads straight for his Italian game. He loves the Italian, especially in blitz time controls. Now here, Magnus, bishop c5, standard stuff. d3, knight f6, c3, and d6 from Magnus. So far, so good. Now here, Hans castles on the king side, and Magnus goes for the move h6. This early h6 idea is getting very, very popular in the Italian in a wide variety of different positions. Now, the problem with doing this too early is white can go b4, immediately expanding on the queen side. That is probably the strongest move. Here, the main line is bishop is b4, bishop b6, a4, a5, b5, knight d7. And here, white can do what he wants. Rook e1, knight d2, h3, all of these ideas. Instead, Hans Niemann ignores that idea. He goes rook to e1 in this position. Then Magnus goes a6. This does take the sting out of b4 ideas, as now the bishop does have that retreat square on the a7 square. Now from here, both sides continue developing. Knight d2, short castles for black. So far, totally standard stuff. And here the main line for white is the move a4, expanding on the queen side. The idea is to go b4 sooner or later, just gaining more space, and overall, it's a very standard Italian position. Now, instead of that, here Hans Niemann went for the move knight to f1. Hans Niemann played this idea over and over in this match. The idea is he wants to go knight f1, then knight to g3 later, without expanding on the queen side with a4 and b4. So it's an interesting idea. It's not quite as strong as the immediate a4, but Hans Niemann had a lot of ideas in this line prepared for this tournament. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen, he simply retreats his bishop back to the a7 square. I do want to point out there is this idea of knight to a5 trying to win the bishop. For example, if the bishop does go back to the b3 square, then black wins it all the same. However, the problem with this move here is white can go for the very fast b4, and this breaks up black's idea. Here, the knight has to take the bishop on c4, then you take the bishop on c5, and overall here, white is actually doing perfectly fine despite the weird pawn structure. So knight to a5, not the best idea. Magnus Carlsen just going bishop a7 in response to the early knight to f1 from Hans Niemann. Now, a couple more normal-looking moves. h3 from Hans, stopping bishop g4 ideas. Magnus goes rook to e8. And now, this was the big shocker of the game, at least for me. Bishop d2 from Hans Niemann. All right, what the heck is the idea behind this move? Well, it turns out the computer really likes it for some reason. I would have never thought that. I would have thought for sure, say, knight g3, bishop e3, a4, b4. These would be all the moves I'd be looking at here. Instead, bishop d2 doesn't really put the bishop on a good square. However, Hans has an idea. Here, Magnus goes rook to e6, a very typical looking Italian move. The idea, of course, is you're trying to challenge that bishop on c4. If white takes on e6, the rook on the e8 square is positioned to recapture. That way you win back the bishop without damaging your pawn structure. That is what happens here. Bishop takes, then rook takes from Magnus Carlsen. And here Hans Niemann does show his idea. He expands on the queen side with the move c4. Now this bishop on d2 may want to go to c3, sort of an artificial fianchetto of the bishop. So overall, that is Hans Niemann's idea. However, it's not particularly strong here, and Magnus Carlsen finds a very good antidote. He just jumps in with the knight to the d4 square. Of course, the move prior, before Hans Niemann went c4, knight d4 was not possible as that pawn does cover the square. However, now after c4, knight d4 is possible. Magnus jumps in with the knight. And the idea here is to try and trade off these knights on the d4 and the f3 square. And then after that, Magnus Carlsen did free the way to go c6 and potentially d5, challenging white's pawn center in the middle of the board. Now here, if Hans Niemann takes the knight on d4, the bishop on a7 is perfectly placed to recapture. Bishop takes d4, and black would have zero problems. Instead, Hans Niemann goes knight g3 in the game. And then Magnus Carlsen, instead of taking on f3, that would be the quote-unquote solid move. Instead, he mixes things up and expands on the queen side with a very aggressive-looking move, b5. So Magnus here showing his intentions. He wants a complicated game where he can play for a win. He thinks he's just the better player in this matchup. Hans Niemann is just not on his level in his own mind. Now, from here, the threat is very obvious. Magnus Carlsen is threatening b takes c4. Then after d takes c4, Hans Niemann will have one more central pawn, and that would give him slightly better control over the center of the board. Down here, Hans Niemann does have a wide variety of moves he can play. He can allow it. For example, the computer loves the idea of b4. Also, b3 is possible, just bolstering the pawn on the c4 square. Instead, Hans Niemann goes for his main idea, bishop to c3, developing the bishop on this long diagonal here. However, the whole idea looks a little bit suspicious. Here, black has those pawns on c7, d6, and e5, and they all block in the bishop. This is essentially a bad bishop on the c3 square here. Now here, the best idea for Magnus Carlsen, there's a very clever idea the computer sees. You take on f3 with the knight, white takes back with the queen, and then you actually go g6. This move looks a little bit weird, but without the bishop on this diagonal here, that pawn on the h6 square is perfectly fine. Black can always go king g7, defending it next. And the benefit of this g6 move is it does lock down on that f5 square, stopping knight to f5 ideas from Hans Niemann. And without that move, Hans Niemann really doesn't have a very good plan in this position. Now instead, Magnus Carlsen starts by taking on the c4 square. B takes c4 on the board. Hans Niemann takes back with the d-pawn. D takes c4. Then Magnus trades on f3. Knight takes, queen takes. And once again, the top computer idea is g6. Again, stopping knight to f5 ideas and taking advantage of the fact the bishop is on this diagonal here instead of the original one on c1 to h6. Now, instead of that, here Magnus goes knight d7. Kind of a curious looking move. Let's see what his idea is. Now Magnus jumps in with the knight to the f5 square. Very good square for the knight. Gary Kasparov once said a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn. So that piece may be the strongest piece on the board right now. But here Magnus, this is his idea of knight d7. He goes rook to f6, pinning the knight on f5 to the queen. And now white has to be super careful. For example, in the future, black may have g6 ideas. And technically, the knight is now pinned and he could lose the knight. So, of course, Hans Niemann, he sees this, queen to e2. And now Magnus plays a couple of very precise moves. First of all, king to h7. The idea of this move is in the future, if he wants to go g6, then that pawn on h6 is defended. So now g6 is an option. Then Hans Niemann rook ad1, centralizing the rook. Good idea. And finally, Magnus goes a5, expanding on the queen side. And this move is especially strong as it stops the idea of b4 for white. For example, if white did that now, then he'd have an absolutely ruined pawn structure on the queen side. And of course, that pawn on e5 is not hanging, as if Hans Niemann does take it with bishop takes a5, then black has the response, bishop takes f2, followed by picking up the bishop on the a5 square, as bishop takes f2 does put the king in check. And from there, white's pawn structure on the king side is going to be damaged, so that is simply no good. So now Hans Niemann, he sees the idea. He goes king to h1, getting out of this line of attack of the bishop. So now bishop takes a5 is actually a legitimate threat. However, this move may not have been the best idea for Hans Niemann. The problem with it is now the pawn on f2 is only defended by the queen. Now we can see if the knight on f5 ever moves, then both the bishop and the rook will be piling up on that pawn on the f2 square. Yes, Hans Niemann can go back to the e3 square with the knight, but overall is not ideal, and that is what happens here. Magnus goes g6, knight to e3 from Hans Niemann, and here Magnus Carlsen finds a brilliant way to get a good knight versus a bad bishop middle game. First he goes rook to e6, a double move. Hans Niemann finally goes rook to f1, increasing defense of that pawn. Perhaps he wants to go f4 next, and here Magnus strikes immediately. First, bishop takes e3. Now, typically, you don't want to give up your bishop in the middle game for a knight unless you have a very good reason to do it, and here Magnus does. Hans Niemann takes back with the queen, and then the key move, g5 from Magnus Carlsen, clamping down on the dark squares on the king side. Of course, now f4 is simply impossible. Black could take back with the g-pawn or the e-pawn. That would be an absolute disaster. But beyond that, look at this bishop on c3 compared to Magnus Carlsen's knight on d7. Here the bishop is literally biting on granite. Hitting those pawns on e5, d6, and c7 is doing absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the knight has the option of getting back into the game on the dark squares. One option is knight to f8, then g6, then f4. The other option is knight b8, then c6, and d4. Either way, d4 or f4, the knight's going to be a monster, and the bishop, at least for the foreseeable future, really isn't doing anything for Hans Niemann. So now we know Magnus Carlsen's plan, rerouting the knight to a better square. However, Hans Niemann has his own ideas. He wants to gain space on the queen side, where he has that 3 versus 2 pawn majority. Now Hans b3, then c5 for Magnus Carlsen, again, further clamping down on the dark squares in this position. A very good idea. Now from here, both sides play a series of maneuvering moves. Not a whole lot happens, so we're going to skip through a little bit. Here, Magnus starts his rerouting of the knight. He goes knight to b8, However, this may have been a little bit problematic. Here, Hans Niemann actually is ready for the pawn break f4, expanding on the king side, and there's a key tactical resource that makes it all possible. Here, f4 is actually the key move for Hans. Now, at first glance, this move looks problematic. For example, black can capture on f4 with the e-pawn, and then after g takes f4, he can win the pawn on the e4 square. However, here, Hans has a series of very good moves available. First of all, queen d3, pinning the rook to the king. That is one of the main ideas. Then if the king moves, you have this really good deflection idea, bishop to f6. And of course, if the queen takes the bishop, then the queen takes the rook on the e4 square. And from here, Hans Niemann actually has a very good initiative, all of his pieces working together. And the big problem for black is that knight on the c8 square is completely out of the game for now. It takes at least 1 or 2 more moves for it to be on a good square. So all this to say, the move f4 on move 29 would have been simply outstanding for Hans Niemann. Instead, he misses it. He goes rook to d5, and here Magnus slowly takes over in the game. He starts knight c6. Now the threat, of course, is knight d4, trapping the rook on the d5 square. And here Hans Niemann sort of ignores the threat. Queen d2, then the knight jumps in. Now the knight on d5 is basically entombed on that square. Fortunately, Magnus Carlsen doesn't have a light spread bishop to win it. If he did, that rook would be a goner. But then queen d3 for Hans Niemann. This is a very good move, setting up various x-ray ideas on the king on the h7 square. And beyond that, Hans Niemann actually lays a trap with this move, and Magnus Carlsen misses it. He simply goes rook to a8. Instead of that, he had to get his king out of this x-ray attack of the queen. He had to go king to g7 or something similar. And here's why. Instead, rook to a8 on the board for Magnus Carlsen as black, and then Hans Niemann shows his idea. Bishop takes d4, an excellent move. Here's the idea. Black cannot take with the e-pawn. E takes d4 would be the right idea, but the problem is here Hans Niemann can actually go e5 with check, hitting the king with the queen, and then follow up either e takes d6 or rook takes d6. And overall, in this position, with the transformation of the pawn structure, Hans Niemann is doing excellent. His queen on d3 does a fantastic job of blockading that pawn on the d4 square. So all this to say, after bishop takes d4, e takes d4 is not possible because of that e5 threat. Instead, c takes d4 is the move for black, but then Hans Niemann rook c1, setting up c5 ideas. And once again, Hans Niemann's piece is starting to look pretty good. The rook on d5 goes from being entombed to being quite active. And again, the queen on d3 does a great job of blockading that pass pawn on the d4 square. Now from here, Hans Niemann does have a little bit of an advantage. Magnus Carlsen needs to defend for a little bit, and both sides play some normal developing moves. Hans Niemann trying to expand on the queen side, and Magnus Carlsen regrouping and playing a little bit defensively. We're going to keep fast forwarding all the way to this position right here. This is the next critical position in the middle game. Here, Hans Niemann is getting anxious. He wants to break through. He goes for the move c5, but it turns out this is a little bit premature. Now, the idea of the move is obvious. Hans Niemann is trying to get a breakthrough on the queen side. His rook is lined up with the queen, which is good for him. The problem, though, is here black has the resource d5, and that is what Magnus Carlsen finds. Now, as these pawns get liquidated here, Magnus Carlsen is going to have those two pass pawns in the center of the board, or sorry, the one pass pawn on d4 and the other pawn on e5 supporting it, and those pawns can start rolling down the board. Now, this is what happens. Rook b6 from Hans Niemann, but here, Magnus Carlsen, does he defend the queen on the c6 square? No, he plays the strong intermediate move, d takes e4, hitting the queen. Now here, if Hans takes the queen on c6, Magnus Carlsen takes the queen on d3, and then those pawns are just rolling down the board. There is no stopping them. So instead, queen c4 on the board for Hans Niemann, but then Magnus Carlsen finds a series of very precise moves. First of all, queen to c8. Then the rooks come off the board. Rook takes, king takes. Hans Niemann goes queen d5. And here, Magnus Carlsen has one move to convert his advantage, and he finds it. d3, getting the pawns rolling. Now, of course, the rook is being hit with check. Hans Niemann is forced to play a little bit defensively here. The best move is going to be something like rook d2 or rook c1 or rook b2. Instead, he goes rook to c4, missing the idea in time trouble. And here, Magnus Carlsen once again finds the only move to crash through. Queen d8, trying to force the queens off the board. Now, if Hans Niemann does take the queen on the d8 square, queen takes d8, then he's basically lost in the rook endgame. After rook takes d8, the idea for Magnus Carlsen is very simple. King to e6, then king d5, putting pressure on the rook and the pawn. His king is going to be in a great position to stop these passed pawns for Hans Niemann and gobble up the queen side. Meanwhile, his pawns in the middle of the board are going to crash through. So, of course, queen takes d8, not the move for Hans Niemann. Instead, he plays queen takes e4, but Magnus Carlsen doesn't mind. He goes d2, trying to crash through with the pawn. Now, of course, the threat is d1, promoting to a queen. The rook cannot stop it. Hans Niemann tries his best. He gives a check to the king, queen to f3, king g7, then queen d1. Literally the only way to stop the pawn. But now Magnus jumps in with the queen, queen d5, hitting the king. The king retreats. Then a4, a deflection move. If Hans Niemann takes the pawn on the a4 square, then queen takes c4, wins the rook for Hans Niemann. So, of course, b takes a4 not possible. Here, Hans Niemann retreats the rook back to the c2 square, but then a takes b3, wins yet another pawn for Magnus Carlsen. Now, rook takes d2, wins that first pass pawn, but queen c4, and now this b pawn is in a position where it might promote. Now, of course, here, both sides are in extreme time pressure. Hans Niemann goes rook d7, then Magnus, he has the winning idea, b2, he misses it in time trouble. Instead, rook takes a3, simply winning the pawn, then rook d6 from Hans, but finally Magnus finds the idea. e2, pushing the pawn. Now the threat is either rook to a1, pinning the queen, or queen to c1. Again, if the queen's trade, then the pawn promotes. And here Hans Niemann in time trouble. He tries to get his queen out of this pin. He goes queen to f3, not realizing that puts you in the line of attack for the rook. Here Magnus Carlsen, he simply picks up the queen on the f3 square, and Hans Niemann, in shame, realizes what happens, and he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen.